Hello everyone, welcome to my series Learn Python with Suchi. In our last video, we've written our very first Hello World program using Replit.com. In this video, we're going to learn a little bit about how to do comments in Python, what are variables, how to use variables in Python, and we're going to see some data types, simple data types in Python, and some simple arithmetic operators in Python. So without further ado, let me get started. And before I can, let me just go ahead and share my screen with you so you can see what I'm doing and follow along. So this is where we ended our last video, where I had asked if you could print these three using three print statements. So I'm assuming you have already done that. So as you can see in my editor right now, I see there's a red underline. Remember from my previous video, anytime you see a red underline, Python Replit is telling you that there is something wrong with your Python syntax. Syntax is the structure in which Python expects you to write statements that it can understand. So in this instance, because there's a red line here, meaning that Python doesn't understand what this is. So if I do try to run this at this point of time, obviously, it is going to tell me that there's some error here. So let me write the print statement I've shown all of you in my previous video. So to be able to print, hello, my name is, I can use simple single quotes, and my name is Suchi, and I'm closing the single quote and closing the parentheses, and that ends the perfect syntax for Python to understand exactly what you're trying to do is print, hello, my name is Suchi. So sometimes in our programming language, we really don't want to execute a command. We're just trying to write notes for ourselves, like a comment, which doesn't have anything to do with Python. It's more to do with the programmer itself. So those are called comments in Python. So to write comments in Python, we start with a pound symbol. Now, anytime anything after that pound is ignored by Python as a comment. So as you can see, everything is grayed out. And this color, if you notice these colors, this is a very light orange, I'm going to say, and this is a dark orange. The Replit is trying to color code it for me to tell me that this is a reserved keyword in Python, and that's why it's coded differently. And these orange are string literals in Python, so it coded it for me, and here it grayed out everything, telling me that that's a comment. So Replit is really smart. It's a smart editor. There are many smart editors out there, but Replit uses this, and I'm going to try and see if I can change my settings and change, if I can figure out how to do it. And right now I don't know if I can, so I'll get back to that later. I'm going to close out the ship. Okay, so that is how I do comments. You can also do a comment in an existing line. So this is a valid Python statement. After this, if I put a pound symbol and say Python will still execute it because everything after this point is a comment. So let me go ahead and finish writing the print statement from our previous exercise. So because my string has a single quote, I'm choosing to use a double quote to open close my print statement. And in this case, because I have double quotes already in my string, I'm just going to use single quotes to open close. And now when I try to execute it, everything executes perfectly and no more errors. So that was where we ended our last video. So this is how to use a comment. In Replit, it's very easy to set a comment. You hold the control button down and hit the backslash key. It will try to comment out the whole code. So if you want to comment out everything, like I said in my video, it is very annoying when Replit does that. So you can select everything that you want to comment, and now hit control and backslash, it'll comment all those lines of code. So when I try to execute it, it will only print the ones that I haven't commented out, which is hello, my name is Suchi, and I'm learning Python with Suchi. All right, so at this point, for this particular video, I'm not going to use this REPL. So I'm going to show you how to create multiple REPLs and keep your code separate. So at this point, if I go to my REPLs, and if you have to verify your email using the email link, go ahead and do that. It's really not necessary at this point to continue working, so I'm not going to bother with that. So this is the REPL that I created. That's the Hello World REPL. If I choose to work, I can choose to work in the same REPL, but I can also create multiple. That's the beauty of Replit.com. It'll let you create as many REPLs as you want. So for this video, I'm going to create a new REPL, and I'm going to choose Python, obviously, and I'm going to rename the title to variables and data types. That's what we're going to learn in today's video. So I'll create a REPL, and voila, the REPL is created with the main.py as the default file. So it's taking just 1 minute. There you go. And do not worry about these packager files. We will learn everything about Replit as we go along. As we learn more about Python, we'll learn more about Replit also. So there's my main.py. I'm not going to worry about the ghostwriter. I'm not using any smart editor. So I'm going to start my first line of code. So before that, I want to explain what is a variable. A variable is a container that you can use to store values. So you've already encountered variables in your algebra class. Anytime you write x is equal to 2, y is equal to 3, and then you try to do x plus y whole square. Or you can say s is the speed of the vehicle, a is the acceleration of the vehicle, t is the time, and you calculate the distance traveled, that all those are called variables because you're storing some value in those, and that value is subject to change at any point of time. So variables are a way to store values in Python. So before I can tell you what type of values we do store in those variables, let me give you a few variable naming conventions. Okay, variable names in Python have to be alphanumeric, that is A through Z or 0 to 9, but it cannot start with a number. So for example, if I want to define a variable, hello, that's a valid variable name in Python, and I can assign some value to that, and we'll see that later on. But it cannot start with a number. That's an invalid variable name. And I cannot use 4 as a variable name because 4 is already a reserved word in Python. We haven't seen any Python keywords yet other than the print command, but we will see more of those as we go forward. So I don't expect you to understand what the reserved words are. So let's not worry about that. But all you have to understand is there are some words in Python that are off limits to be used as a variable name. So otherwise, anything that's alphanumeric and underscores is valid in Python. You cannot use an at symbol or a pound symbol or an exclamation, but you can definitely use an underscore. So let me show you some valid variable names and some invalid variable names. And then we will get into data types and we'll start storing those values in those variables. So one valid variable name is hello. Another could be simply x. And another valid name could be I like using underscores. So I'm separating all of these using underscores. Don't worry about those red underlines yet. Once we start assigning values to those, they will go away. So another one, another valid name would be so you can have alphabets, numerics, alphabets, underscores, and you cannot. So invalid would be anything that starts with a number is an invalid variable name. Anything that has special characters like or these are invalid variable names. So let's go ahead and comment out all of these right now. So control and backslash will comment out everything. Now we're going to start talking about data types. So we know that we have a container named hello, and we want to store some value. What are the different types of values that you can store in Python in a variable? There are four very simple, basic built-in data types in Python. There are more complex ones that we will see later, but the simplest ones are, number one, integer. If I can spell correctly, that is integer, or float, and I will explain what these are, and string, and last one is Boolean. Integer is when you want to store whole numbers in a variable. So if I want to store, say, the number of people attending an event, it has to be an integer value. Obviously, cannot be a decimal value in there. So then I would assign that to a variable. That's an integer. Float is when you have decimal points. If a number, it's absolutely a numeric data type, but it also has decimal points. So that is a float number. And then string is where you can store string values. So for example, if you want to store your name in a variable, that would be a string. And Boolean is a very special, my favorite data types is when you can store values like true or false. So we will get to see, I'll tell you more about Boolean later on once we start using it, and it'll get easier. So anything that's true and false is a Boolean variable. So hello, let me try to store a value of integer, which is a whole number. So I'm going to store 58786. That's my integer value. And if I wanted to store a float value, it would be anything that has a decimal value, whatever the precision is, that is a floating point. And here, if I want to store, say, instead of I like Python, hey, let me just say my name, because variable names, while they are valid, also have to make sense. So as a convention, we try to name our variables to make sense to what you're storing in them. So I'm going to name it, my underscore name is equal to, and remember how we did our print statement, we use single quotes or double quotes. So we do the same thing here too. We can either use two double quotes to encapsulate our string in, or we can use two single quotes. And the last type of data variable would be Boolean. So anytime you want to store a value of true or a value of false, you would use a Boolean variable, or that becomes a Boolean variable. So now let me try to print all of these. So remember how we printed hello world? We put in double quotes. So what happens if I try to print hello? In this case, which is actually a variable. So if I try to print hello, it's simply going to print hello. But hey, that's not what I'm trying to do. I am trying to print the value of hello. In that case, you cannot use the quotes. When you don't use quotes, you're telling Python, I'm not actually trying to print hello, I'm trying to print what is stored in hello. And at this point, I'll run it and it'll print the value that is stored in hello. So if I want to do the same thing with x, so it would be print x, print my underscore name, and print 77. So in your print statement, if you try to use a variable name that you have not used or defined previously, Python will give you an error. So if I try to run, it'll print all the values stored in those variables. So the way to print variables is to not use single or double quotes. So that is the basic data types that Python uses. Now, I'm going to show you the basic operations, mathematical operations that are going to be really simple. What are the four basic mathematical operations that we know? My 6-year-old is trying to learn addition and subtraction and multiplication and division. So those are the four that I'm going to show you. So if we have given all of these four variables, let's try to do some arithmetic on them. So if I want to do addition, what happens when I try to add, well, I'm going to say variable 2 is equal to hello plus hello. And then I'll just try to print this variable and see what happens. So just by looking at the code, as a human being, I can say hello is 5786, and then I'm adding 5786 to it, and that is I'm storing that in variable too. So a variable is not just a container for values, it is also a container for expression, mathematical expression. You can do all your calculations and store the value in the variable. So what happens when I try to do that? So we calculate the sum and you can print it using the variable to name. So what happens if I try to print, I'm also going to, just for educational purposes, I'm going to print what is the type of the variable. So I have not introduced you to this yet. So this is the first time we're going to see, what if I don't want to know the value, I just want to know the type of the variable. So when you try to add two integers, because we know hello is an integer value, try to add another integer to it, what will be the resultant integer's data type? So I want to print that too. So that's why I'm using type, and I'm using a parentheses and close it with a parentheses. Now this is an enclosing parentheses for the print statement, and these are the enclosing statements for the type statement. So let's try to run that and see what happens. So int here means it's an integer. So when you add two integers, Python will store the resultant value in another integer variable. So now looking at that int gave me an idea. How can I tell before I even have a value 5786? How can I tell Python that I want to create a variable and I want to store an integer value. I just don't know what the value is just yet. How can I do that? So in that instance, I can use hello is equal to int open close parentheses. That's as simple as that, because it's int is a keyword that Python uses to tell that this person at this point of time, the programmer doesn't know the value of the integer, but they know that it is going to be an integer value. So why do we have to tell Python that it's an integer? We'll get to that in just a second. So if I didn't know the value, this is how I can say it's an integer. And if I try to print the type, need to comment out everything at this point. Let's see. Hello is an integer. Now I'm telling print the type of hello. Python should tell me that it is a class int, right? And we'll see what class means and all of that in our much later videos, but let's focus on just that part. So if I want to create a float, and I don't know the value yet, but I know it's going to be a decimal number, then I would use something called float open close parentheses, and float is a reserved word in Python, and that you cannot use for a variable. So my underscore name at this point, I don't know what value I'm going to store in it yet, but I definitely know it's going to be a string. So I would use a reserved word str open close parentheses. And the last type is the Boolean, and kilo 77 is equal to bool, B-O-O-L, open close parentheses. As simple as that. So here I want to mention something about Python's case sensitivity. Python is a case sensitive language. So because int open close parentheses creates an integer, doesn't mean I can go ahead and do this. I uppercase and nt, as soon as I do that, the Replit tells me that's an error, because Python doesn't, Python demarcates the case. So it always has to be a lowercase int. Similar, same thing with print. Your print statement cannot be uppercase p or all uppercase print. It has to be all lowercase print. Same thing with type, and so on and so forth. And with variable names, if you try to create a variable name hello and try to print hello, as a human being, you can see that that's hello, but Python marks it distinctly different from all lowercase hello. So you get the picture. So now let's go back to our addition. So we've seen how to add two integer values. What happens if I try to add an integer and a float? So at this point, my float is x. So what happens to variable 2's type and its value, obviously, when I try to do that? So it adds 5786 to 3 and makes 5789. Let me just go ahead and comment out all of these. This time I don't need that. So I'm going to run it again. So as you can see, 5786 plus 3.567 is 5789.567. And look at the class, look at the type of the variable. Now it became a float. So when you add an integer and a float, the resultant variable's type is going to be a float. So what happens if I try to add an integer and a string? Can you do that? I mean, think of it as a human being. Can you do that? Can you add a number and a string together? What's going to happen? Well, obviously, Python gave me an error. So I'm like, okay, maybe I cannot add an integer to a string. What happens if I try to add an integer and a Boolean? A Boolean is a true or false. So I'm going to run it and we're going to see what happens. That worked. So as you can see, 5786 plus false gave me the value 5786, and it's telling me the type is still integer. How did that happen? So let me try and change this value to true. And what happens? It is 5787 now. So I can assume safely that Python considers false as a 0 and true as a 1. And if you've used any Boolean logic in your math before, that's how it is always notated. For every false, for false is always notated as a 0 and true is always notated as a 1. So that applies true too. So I would make a cheat sheet at this point to see what happens when two integers are added, when an integer and float is added, when an integer is string, it doesn't work. When an integer and a Boolean is added together. So we've done addition on all 4 of our data types. Let's see what happens with subtraction. I'm going to skip the subtraction and I'm going to give you that as an exercise to do. And subtraction symbol in Python is just like in our normal life, it's a minus. So we use a minus symbol, just like we've used plus for addition, we use minus for subtraction. So try that and let me know. And then multiplication, we use the operator star. So we don't really have an X symbol in Python. X is not considered an operator. So if you want to multiply two numbers, you just use a star. So I'm going to copy this whole code. And while I'm at it, I'm just going to comment it out because I don't want it right now. So let's start off with what we did earlier. And instead of addition, I'm going to say multiplication. So when I try to multiply two integers, what will happen is that they're multiplied and the type of that variable is an integer. So when you multiply two integers, the resultant type is also an integer. At this point, if I try to use x, which is a float, in my case, in the way that I've defined here, x is a floating point. So when I try to multiply an integer and a float, well, the resultant is also a float, and the value is calculated. Now, if I try to do an integer and a string. Remember, when we tried to add an integer and a string, Python didn't like it. It gave me an error. Wonder what happens here. Whoa. So let me set it to a small number so it's probably easier for computations. So when I try to multiply an integer and a string, Python simply repeated that string that many times. So because my hello value was 5 and my string was Suchi, it tried to replicate Suchi 5 times. And the class or the type of the resultant variable is a string now. Isn't that incredible? All right, let me try to see what happens if I try to multiply an integer with a Boolean. So we've already seen that a Boolean value of true is computed to 1. So hello is 5 and kilo 77 is 1 if you try to doing a mathematical operation. So it obviously would be a 5. And the class is an integer. So if I try to do a false, it'll be a 0. So that is the multiplication of all the data types, the integer, float, string, and Boolean data types. So here's an exercise for you to also try division and make your observations and see what happens when you try to divide each data type with another one. So be mindful, don't try to divide when this is false, because any number divided by 0 will be a problem because it cannot be computed. So try to set this value to true, okay? Because we've already seen that false always computes to 0. So what happens when you try to divide an integer and a float? What happens when you try to integer and a integer? And does it display the remainder? Does it display the quotient? So try to see it for yourself. So that is an exercise for you to do, and share your REPL in your comments. If you have any questions, if you don't understand, always feel free to ask me any questions. So this is where I end this video today, and I hope you've understood variables and data types.